Hello everyone, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink. For today's card, I am using another oldie but goodie favorite. This one from Simon Says Stamp. This is the Sketch Tulips stamp set that came out years ago. I've done other videos using this set, and I always want to pull it out like this time of year because tulips, hello. So this time I thought I would do some no-line watercolor. Every once in a while, I keep dipping my toes into the whole no-line coloring thing. So I am stamping the image with antique linen distress oxide ink. I want to experiment with that. Usually people use the antique linen distress ink, just the regular distress ink, for no-line, which I've done as well. And it's fine, but I was like, I wonder if it makes any difference using the oxide. And I think in the end, the only difference is just the ink kind of sits up and I can see it better. So I'm thinking I'm going to kind of stick with this, so I really like it. So I stamped it with the Distress Oxide ink onto some Strathmore Ready Cut watercolor paper. And then for the actual watercoloring, I'm just using my little Prima Classics palette. I would say this is a really good beginner palette. If you're just like getting into watercoloring that, because one, the price point is good, plus it gives you kind of your standard set of colors. So for the actual coloring or like use of color, I'm keeping it pretty simple. I'm just using the yellow for the tulips, and the whole thing with no line watercolor is you need to keep each section away from the other because you don't want them, seeping and bleeding into each other, because then you lose any definition whatsoever. So the nice thing about having this stamped twice is I can do, I'm basically just doing each petal that is not next to the other one, and then I can turn it around and work on the other image, and then that gives each one a chance to dry. Although another option, rather than like stamping it twice and doing twice as much, would be just to use a heat tool to dry each area. I do that a lot too, just depends on what I'm working on. But I wanted a nice little cluster of tulips for my cards, and the space was also here on the watercolor paper, so I stamped it the two times. So I just kept flipping it back and forth and just painting with that one color. And then the other thing I was doing is I have two brushes in rotation. I'm just using my little Zen watercolor brushes from Simon Says Stamp. These Royal Langnickel Zen brushes. They're so cheap. Literally a few bucks for these brushes. I'm using a size 4 for all of this. And I have 2 of them. I've been slowly getting multiples of these brushes because it's nice to have one for color and then one for just that's clean, with just clean water. So that's what I'm doing. I'm adding the color with one brush, not cleaning that brush because then I can just keep using it over and over again. And then using the clean brush to kind of pull the color and move it around. So after I did my first layer on everything, flipping it back and forth, they're all painted in. You could always leave it here, but I'm like experimenting more and more with going in and adding more definition, deepening colors. That's also what gives the whole no line look more of a finished look, I guess. So to deepen that yellow, I add purple. That just, darkens the color. You basically want to go opposite on like a standard color wheel. Opposite colors can be used to darken the color. Another thing though is if you go too far with it, it can turn into mud. So it just takes some experimenting. I just found adding a tiny bit of purple to that yellow, just got it to a nice deeper shade, almost like getting into more of a golden shade. And that gave me the definition I wanted so that I can go in and, darken areas and add that little bit of shading, everything like that. And I'm doing the same thing. I'm using one brush to add the color, and then I'm using a clean brush with just clean water on it to move the color around and pull it out. And then same thing, working on one section at a time, flipping things around, working on a different petal. So I keep going back and forth. Obviously I've sped this up a ton in editing. Like a lot of this is like 2,000 times faster than it took. This is definitely one of those projects where all this painting took me probably well over an hour. I don't time myself really when I do this, and even the footage, it's all because there's so many pieces of it, so it's not one long stretch that I can say exactly how long it took me. Because I would get up and go do other things, feed the kids, etc., etc. So I would just keep coming back to it and working on it throughout the day. But I think altogether, it probably took a good hour to do like this many layers and like 2 large images like this. So yeah, practice. That's all I can say. Like my first attempts at no line were I wasn't happy with. But the more you do it, and same with just watercolor in general. I know, because a lot of people comment that, like, oh, I'll never be this good, or I'll never get it, because I don't consider myself that great. There's so many other great, you know, watercolor card makers out there. But yeah, I remember my very first attempts at watercolor, and I was just like so frustrated, and I was like, why are things not doing the way they, you know, the way I want them to, blah, blah, blah. But practice. The more you do it and you start figuring it out, and you figure out what, you know, what paper works for you, or what watercolor you like, or this, that, and the other thing, like, it literally is just practice. And if I can do it, anyone can do it. Because when I first started watercoloring, that was however many years ago, you know, 6 or 7 years ago, whenever it was, I struggled a lot. It just, things weren't working. And then, you know, over the years, the more I did it, the more I'm starting to figure out, and the more comfortable I am with it. Definitely a ton more comfortable. In fact, I watercolor a lot of times. Not no line like this. I don't do this very often because it's very time consuming. And while I enjoy it, I really love it, I just don't usually have the time for it. So anywho, that's my little random watercolor pep talk for the day. So I did the same thing with the leaves. I used just the basic green from the palette first, painted everything, used my clean brush to move the color around, etc. And then I added blue to the green just to give it a bit of a darker look. You can use red as well. Red will make it more like kind of deeper, almost give it that little bit of a brown tone. But I added blue this time just because I really love the look when you add blue to green, you know, because of that gorgeous color. And then did the same thing, just went in and added a second layer here and there and kind of painted in some of the detail with my brush, and then that just darker green shade. So I did that to both. I didn't bother filming the second one because at this point it's kind of obvious. And then this is where I channeled my inner Debbie Hughes. If you don't follow Debbie Hughes, she also is known as Lime Doodle Design. She's got a blog and a YouTube channel and her Instagram. Her watercoloring is just mwah, chef's kiss. It's amazing. I stalk her. I love her watercoloring, and I love her, like, she uses very muted colors. That's her thing. But another thing she does a lot, and I picked this up from her, is to take, this is where I'm taking some Ranger Perfect Pearl powder. I'm just going to put some in my little palette here and mix it with water and splatter it. She does that with her watercolor, and I love the look of it. I love that, the splatter look, but I also love that shimmer. So totally channeling her when I did this. So I added yellow splatter first, just with the yellow watercolor. And then I'm adding this Perfect Pearl splatter quite heavily because it's pretty and shimmery. You can also do, like, add the Perfect Pearl and actually, like, watercolor with it, like mix it in with your watercolors if you want. It's definitely worth having a little container of that on hand because, you know, you can also add it to a little spritz bottle, and then you've got a shimmery spritz, like just the basic Perfect Pearl powder and Perfect Pearl, and I'll have a link to it with my supplies, is like kind of like a little must-have tool, or must-have shimmer product, I guess that you can call it. So after all that splatter, let everything completely dry, and then I die cut it with the coordinating wafer die. And then I have my card base here, and I put a tiny little bit of honeycomb dot tape on the back of it just to hold it in place in my MISTI. I removed the foam piece or foam insert from my MISTI, and I pulled out this oldie but goodie. This came out years and years and years ago. This is the diagonal stripe background from Simon Says Stamp. This is still available in their store, and again, I'll have links to everything. I love this stamp. I used to use it all the time, like all the time. I've been like going through my stuff and like pulling out just oldies and stuff, and it's like, I remember this, I love this, so I'm trying to make use of them. So the little bit of adhesive, I inked up the stamp with Blueprint Sketch Distress Oxide ink, and it like clung to the card and like pulled it right up, which was fine. Stamped it with that. It isn't perfect. I didn't want it to be. I just wanted the stripes. I'm going to add more splatter. I said this in a previous video that, you know, when I get back on the splatter train, I splatter everything. And I'm not kidding. I'm not exaggerating. Like, everything. I splattered the water. I'm splattering the card background. I splattered myself. In the process of doing this, even though I'm using my SPLATBOX, I managed to get splatter all the way up to my elbows. I'm covered in blue spots. It's just... I had fun. So first I pushed the ink pad lid against the ink pad to get some color, and then added water and splattered. That's a way to get a very light splatter. I wanted a lot on this background. Like, I wanted it just covered. I wanted it kind of distressed and splattery and all that stuff. So I ended up smushing the ink pad on the acetate sheet that the background stamp comes on, adding some water, and then just pulling the brush against the edge of the sheet. And that's where you can see you can get the tons of splatter in all different sizes, and I used all of it. And literally, like, I protected my work surface with a splat box, but I don't know exactly how I managed to get it all the way out, like all over my hands, all the way up to my elbows. I'm sure it was on my clothes, but I was wearing a blue shirt, so I couldn't really tell. But yeah, I had fun with it. So I let that completely dry. And I used my little adhesive eraser to remove that tiny bit of adhesive I had put on the back of the card base. And then I put the insert back into my MISTI because I'm going to stamp with the clear stamps again. So I'm going to line up that tulip stamp again onto the inside of my card. And then I'm going to ink up the tulip stamp with 2 Distress Oxide inks. So I have Mustard Seed and Modelon. And I've shown this in a ton of videos. I'll use like the edge of the ink pads and the corner of the ink pads when I'm trying to ink up specific areas. And then when I discovered, because with this, it was a little hard to see, like usually I get my head right down and I'm looking like at eye level with the stamp. But then I realized if I just stamp, like basically hold the MISTI platform, hold the lid, and then kind of ink it up just like I'm showing now, I can literally see, you know, where the edge of the ink pad is. It still doesn't need to be perfect. I'm not worried about that. Like, it doesn't need to be perfect. I don't need to get the green exactly where the green's supposed to go and the yellow exactly where it's supposed to go. I just wanted to make sure I had it inked up. So inked it up with those ink pads, and then I'm going to stamp that onto the inside of the card. And then once that's stamped, I'm going to take one of the sentiments from that Sketch Tulip Bouquet set, line that up, and I'm going to ink that up with VersaFine Claire Nocturne ink. So got that lined up on the inside of the card, ink that up with the black ink, stamp that. Now the inside of the card is done. So after that's done, now I'm going to die cut, like that's just my theme this month. Oldie but goodie. This is the Painted Thanks Wafer die. This came out, again, years ago. And I have used this so many times. There's the Painted Thanks and there's the Painted Friend. I think there's a Painted Hello. I forget how many. I think there's a Hugs one as well. And I have used these so many times over the last however many years since they come out. So I die cut this from some Nina Desert Storm cardstock. And I die cut it 3 times. And then I'm just stacking those 3 layers together with some craft tacky glue. And yeah, you can see some of the blue smears on my hands. So anywho, got those stacked together, and then now all I need to do is start assembling this card. So I'm going to adhere those tulips to my card base with the craft tacky glue. Just kind of center them there on my card base. And this is a standard A2 size card, by the way, so 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. So it also gives you an idea how big this tulip stamp is, which is also why I love it. So got those adhered. I'm going to adhere the sentiment. And then I also pulled out, Studio Claudia released some Cafe au lait pearls, which are perfect. They're like the color of craft. So if you're ever using like Desert Storm cardstock or craft cardstock, these match so nicely. And they're also like, they have that iridescent shimmer coating on them, which is really, really pretty. So I wanted to add those just to bring out more of that craft color, because that is part of the color throwdown challenge this week, which I will have posted and linked in my blog post. So sprinkled a few of these onto the background of my card. And then once I was happy with that, I'm going to adhere them into place with that craft tacky glue and my little embellishment wand. And then once all of these are adhered, this card is complete. So like I said, this is for this week's Color Throwdown Challenge. I will have a link to that challenge in my blog post. I'll have the inspiration image, which is exactly like I take things literally. So this whole card was inspired by the inspiration image. But yeah, I'll have that. I'll also have a link to the video or to the post in the description box below. I'll have a supply list. I'll have links to all the supplies I used, so you can check that out below as well as on my blog. Thank you guys so much for watching, for subscribing, for thumbs upping, for commenting. I really appreciate it. I will see you all very soon in the next video. Bye.